My name's Ken Tebo. I was the fire chief for the district of Salmon Arm for 25 years, and also the fire chief in 1998 when we had our major fire event. It started all very innocently. We were out on the back deck having coffee, and back deck of the fire hall having coffee, and beautiful day, very hot weather we've had for weeks. There was one little cloud in the sky, and all of a sudden out of this little cloud came a bolt of lightning. It hit the mountain across the valley from us, and we thought we better keep an eye on it, so we watched it for 5 or 10 minutes, and it started going up the mountainside rather quickly. Forest Service was notified. They brought in a water bomber to attack it, but by then it had already taken off and was racing up the mountain and virtually unstoppable. It went to the top of the mountain and then kind of hung around up there for 3 or 4 days. We were keeping an eye on it. We set up a small emergency operations center, not too worried about the fire at this point in time, until about 3-4 days later we had a wind event, and it blew the fire from the top of the mountain down the mountain. Very high winds impacting the little village of Silver Creek and coming across the valley and threatening the city of Salmon Arm. We could hear the radio transmissions from the Silver Creek Fire Department, so I sent one of my captains down to Silver Creek just to see what was going on, and he radioed back, "We've got big trouble." So by then the smoke was filling the town. You could barely see where you were going. We had people that were in immediate danger to the south of Salmon Arm. By this time, some of the buildings in Silver Creek had burnt. What I decided to do was try and get some more resources into town, and I was on the executive of the BC Fire Chiefs Association at the time, so I knew most of the fire chiefs in the area. And I called everybody from Kamloops, Revelstoke, Kelowna, and all points in between to see if they would send us some equipment and manpower, which they did. Money was never discussed. They said, it could be us next time, so what do you need? All these pieces of equipment and manpower started showing up in town, and we had no way of really keeping track of them. So we had to devise something. So we had a large map of the city, and we used bottle caps with the unit numbers on them to move them around like chessmen on the map, so nobody would get lost. We also had to give each unit one of our volunteer firefighters and a portable radio, because everybody operated on different frequencies, and they didn't know their way around town, so our local firefighters acted as their guides. They were fairly successful in saving some buildings down to the south of Salmon Arm. It got very, very hot and smoky, and some of our crews had to abandon the hose lines where they were fighting fire just to get out of the path of the fire and retreat to safer ground. Fortunately, the wind died down later that evening, and the fire settled down, and we were once again kind of back to normal the next morning, if you could call it normal. By this time, we had a lot of people show up for Emergency Operations Center. We had everybody from BC Hydro, the railroads, the highways, the Forest Service, of course, emergency planning. They all were in town. We even had a full-blown weather station brought into town. So the fire was sitting there for a while, and we went into a briefing one morning, and the meteorologist was crying, actually. She was in tears, telling us that there was going to be a major wind event coming up the next day. So after the meeting, I talked to Roy Benson, who is the fire boss for the Forest Service, and asked him, what would you recommend we do from a structural firefighting standpoint? And he said, well, if I were you, I would get as many fire trucks into this town as I could. So having that put out to me, I decided that I should request the fire commissioner provide some funding to bring in additional trucks. We also requested all the trucks that were here earlier and their complement of men to return to Salmon Arm. At about 9 o'clock, I got word from the fire commissioner that he had authorized authorized me to bring some more trucks in from the lower mainland. This was at 9 p.m. I phoned a friend of mine, Fire Chief Wayne Markell from the township of Langley, and asked him if we could get a dozen fire trucks in Salmon Arm. And he said, I'll see what I can do when you need them. I advised him we needed them at 6 o'clock the next morning. He said, well, I'll see what I can do, and by 11 o'clock that night he phoned me back and said that they had 12 fire trucks on the way to Salmon Arm and they would be here first thing in the morning. Sure enough, they arrived at about 7 o'clock the next day. That was August the 10th, the day we were expecting the big windstorm. The windstorm never happened. It did happen, but the wind stayed aloft, and we were spared the big firestorm that we were all extremely worried about. By this time, half of the town had been evacuated. We had set up reception centers throughout the area for people who were displaced. A lot of the firefighters had sent their families to friends and relatives out of town, and we were expecting the very worst. We had a couple incidents that were one incident that was a little bit unusual. When the fire trucks came up from the coast, they had to go through the toll booth on the Coquihalla Highway, and they were determined they weren't going to pay any toll, so they just turned on their lights and sirens and blew through. And the people in the toll booth were not very happy with them, but that kind of all got blown over in the end. The people in Salmon Arm were a great asset. They pulled together. They fed us for the first couple days. The Salvation Army was in town and fed the firefighters. People were helping people evacuate. We had animals that had to be moved. It was a major undertaking. And as a result of the fire, the cooperation between the Forest Service and the structural firefighting community proved to be very good and successful, and turned out as a template for pretty much every wildfire since then, including the major fire in Cologne in 2003. So all in all, it was quite an ordeal for the people in Salmon Arm. Fortunately, we were spared the major devastation that could have occurred.